I was muted to start out there. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining me on this lunchtime webinar called Phasing Out Gasoline in Rhode Island. My name is Mouse Goran. I am the Transportation Policy and Program Coordinator for Green Energy Consumers Alliance. It seems like folks are still trickling in. So as we give everyone an opportunity to log on, I just wanted to go over a few logistics for today's webinar. The first is that everyone is muted to avoid background noise, but I would love your participation today as much as possible, so feel free to use the Q&A box that you should see on your screen to ask questions throughout the webinar. I'm going to go over a lot of material and information today, so I'll dedicate plenty of time to questions at the end so that you can either ask for clarification or kind of have this conversation through this webinar. The webinar is being recorded and will be shared afterwards, so don't feel like you have to take notes or like you might miss something, because we will send a follow-up email with all of the slides as well as any links that can help you take action steps today to help support the phase out of gasoline in Rhode Island, which we do have a few exciting opportunities that I'll be excited to share. I see we've reached critical mass, so I'm going to go ahead and get started with the presentation. For those of you who aren't as familiar with Green Energy Consumers Alliance, we're a nonprofit organization based in Massachusetts and Rhode Island, and our mission is to harness the power of energy consumers to speed the transition to a low carbon future. This is actually our 40th year as an organization, 20th in Rhode Island, and for the last 40 years we've been advocating on behalf of energy consumers to make energy both more affordable and greener for folks. We've done that in a variety of ways, particularly through our energy programs, starting with our heating oil program that acted as a buyer's club to help Massachusetts homeowners who heat with oil to be able to get better prices on that oil. That program continues to this day, which has been especially important in the context of rising oil prices, which also plays an impact on our motivation to transition away from gasoline to low carbon alternatives. So in addition to helping folks be able to better afford home heating, we also run a variety of renewable energy programs to make renewable energy more affordable and accessible to individuals as well as communities. And we also have a program called Drive Green, which is something that I've worked on over the last couple of years to help educate folks on the benefits of driving an electric vehicle and help connect them to dealerships where they'll be able to get a good price on a car that meets their needs and is also better for the environment. So if you're interested in learning more about all of the great work that we've done over the last 40 years or any one of our different energy programs, I encourage you to visit our website so that you can get more information about that. Today, I'll be focusing on one of our key priorities in the advocacy arena, because we know we can't just run energy programs. We need to be able to influence and enact policies that help a much wider transition to more affordable and cleaner energy. And that is our effort and campaign to normalize the idea of a phase out of gasoline in Rhode Island. So I'll start off by talking a little bit about Rhode Island climate goals and what they mean for the transportation sector. Then I'll talk about what a phase out of gasoline actually means for consumers as well as lawmakers and policy advocates. I'll shift to talking about whether a phase out of gasoline starting in 2030 is even possible, and all of the different factors that make us believe here at Green Energy Consumers that yes, we can start to phase out gasoline very quickly, but we need to act now. And so with regards to acting now, Green Energy Consumers has been a big advocate this year for a bill called the Electric Transportation Act, which we believe will get us on track to being able to phase out gasoline, as well as help Rhode Islanders access a variety of low carbon transportation options in the state. And then we'll close it out with Q&A, which I'm hoping I'll get some great questions from you all in the audience. So again, just another plug please use that Q&A box because I'd love to hear what your questions are and to make this as interactive as possible. So the first thing I want to talk about is the Act on Climate, which is a policy that was passed in 2021, just last year, in Rhode Island through the legislature that codified Rhode Island's climate and greenhouse gas emissions reduction goals into mandatory targets. So what that means is that the state is now required to reduce greenhouse gases by a certain percentage starting in 2030, at which point we have to reduce emissions by 45%. And then we have until 2050 to reach net zero emissions economy-wide. So this is a big deal. The bill also required every state agency to be able to consider climate in its mission and decision making. So we think that the Act on Climate was a really important tool to be able to spur action at every branch of government so that we can address the climate change issue. And the image that you see on the screen there, I think is a pretty good symbol of one of our biggest problems when it comes to climate warming emissions, which is transportation. Now, the Act on Climate set goals, it set targets, and it gave the authority to state agencies to act. But what it didn't do is it didn't create a plan. It didn't say, this is how we reach our climate goals. And so as advocates here at Green Energy Consumers Alliance, we've been looking at these targets that the state has now mandated to act on climate. And we're looking at the largest consumer of fossil fuels in the state, which is personal vehicles. If you look at this data that came from the Department of Environmental Management in 2018, you can see a breakdown of where our climate warming emissions are coming from. And you'll see all the way on the left-hand side is transportation, which is the largest emitting sector in Rhode Island. The image there shows like a big heavy-duty truck, but the source that's most responsible for emissions in the transportation sector is passenger vehicles. They account for about 75% of emissions from transportation. And so it's the single largest source of greenhouse gases that we have. We have other big sources as well, such as the electricity sector and the heating sector, which are also key priorities for green energy consumers to start to figure out how we can decarbonize. But a major priority for us is trying to figure out how we can reduce gasoline consumption so that we can make transportation emissions go in the right direction, which is down. One thing that this graphic doesn't show is the fact that the analysis by the Department of Environmental Management in Rhode Island indicated that between 2017 and 2018, which is the most recent data that we have, emissions actually trended upwards. So the data shows we're going in the wrong direction, and we need a plan to help us meet that first 2030 deadline that Rhode Island has. And we at Green Energy Consumers believe that electric vehicles, or EVs for short, are absolutely critical to being able to meet the state's 2030 Act on Climate goal. This data that comes from the Union of Concerned Scientists shows that compared to the typical gas-powered vehicle, an electric vehicle charged in Rhode Island reduces emissions by about 75%. So it's a huge decline, and that's taking into consideration the electricity mix and the resources that provide our electricity and their emissions as well. So a point that we often hear is that, how can electric vehicles be cleaner if we have electricity powered by fossil fuels? Well, the answer is that our electricity mix is getting cleaner all of the time, and it's already much better than most people think, especially when you compare it to gasoline, which is 100% fossil fuel, very high emissions intensive. And so electric vehicles aren't only better now, but they're going to get better over time. I want to make a quick plug for another one of Green Energy Consumers' top priorities this year, which is establishing a mandate to get to 100% renewable electricity by 2030. As you can see here, It's very possible with all of the oncoming offshore wind resources that are being developed off the coast of Rhode Island and regionally. And so we think that this goal is not only achievable, but will help us tackle emissions from the electricity sector and create a pathway to make electric cars get cleaner over time. So EVs emit just a fraction of what gas-powered cars do currently, and every electric vehicle that's put on the road today will actually have fewer emissions per mile as time goes on because we have very aggressive renewable energy goals. So you can see the purple there is the emissions trajectory if we do nothing and commit and don't advance our renewable energy goals at all. And then the green line is what will happen if Rhode Island passes 100% renewable electricity by 2030, which is very likely for this session. So you can see it's a very steep decline in emissions from vehicles, and it creates a pathway for transportation to be zero emissions on a very fast deadline. And so we think this is really the way forward in order to address the gasoline consumption that's causing emissions in Rhode Island. The question is, are we going to get enough electric vehicles on the road to be able to take advantage of the fact that electricity is getting cleaner all of the time and we have an increasing amount of zero emission energy resources? Right now, it's not looking so good. So you can see on the chart there, there is about 3.6% of total new car sales in Rhode Island are electric, which is a very, very small proportion of vehicles compared to all of the cars that are actually on the road. So if we continue down this path and electric vehicle sales inch up slowly over the next couple of years, then we'll only get to about half as many electric vehicles that we need in order to meet the state's climate goals. So if we continue on the current trajectory, we'll have about 40,000 electric cars on the road by 2030. We really need to be shooting much higher at about 100,000 electric cars on the road by 2030. And so we are behind. We're moving slowly. Rhode Island actually has the lowest EV adoption rate of any state in New England. And so in terms of just looking at our next door neighbors, Massachusetts, Connecticut, Vermont, they're all passing very aggressive legislation to be able to support electric vehicle charging, incentives to help folks afford the cost of electric vehicles, and policies that generally just kickstart the demand for EVs that's coming. And so we think policies like this are going to be really important to help meet that 2030 goal, but it's not enough. So in the chart that I showed you previously, I was just looking at I was comparing sales compared to the total number of electric cars that we're going to need to meet the climate goal. But the problem with gas-powered cars that can't easily be undone in a short amount of time is that they last a very long time. The average vehicle age of a car in New England is 11 years. And I'm sure we all know folks in our lives who drive cars that are much older than that, 15 or 20 years old. So what that means is for every gas-powered vehicle that we're putting on the road today, we are committing to decades of additional gasoline consumption that's going to work against us when it comes to meeting our climate goals. Another way to look at it is that if only about 4% of new car sales are electric in Rhode Island, then that means that 96% of the new cars that we're putting on our roads, the cars that are going to last for decades, are gas powered. And so we think that this is a real problem in terms of the long-term strategy of the state to be able to make sure that we have enough electric cars on the road to meet our climate goals. Quite simply, if we keep putting new polluters on the roads, we're not going to stand a chance of meeting our climate goals and reducing emissions from transportation. And so the idea that Green Energy Consumers has been working on over the last year or so with a variety of stakeholders and national groups and other folks that want to see a gasoline-free future is the idea of a phase out of gasoline vehicles starting in 2030. So what does that mean exactly? It doesn't mean that we're going to be taking existing gas-powered cars off the roads. Rather, it means that the state should be planning for 100% of new car sales to be electric starting in 2030. This is a policy that would only be affecting new cars starting that date. So what that means is we can very quickly transition our fleet from gas-powered to electric if we focus on new cars, which are a tiny proportion of the total vehicles that are on the road in any given year. So to give you a visual conception of what I mean by that, we've developed a little animation to help show what a fleet transition could look like if we stop selling new gas-powered cars starting in 2030. That's right. So I hope you were able to see that, where the animation is kind of new on our end. But as you can see, it really takes as long as 20 years, if not longer, to transition the fleet that we have. And so that means that it's a common sense policy to be able to move forward. The other key benefit of a phase out of new gasoline powered vehicles is that it's a policy that primarily affects folks who are higher income. New car buyers represent just a fraction of the car market in the US, and folks that buy new cars tend to be of higher means. And so we think that if we can target policies that encourage a faster transition to new car sales being electric, then that means it's a policy that really only affects a small portion of the population who have the means to do so. So in this way, it's a really fair way to increase electric vehicle adoption, and it is a policy that can help move the needle forward without only relying on providing purchase incentives, which can be high cost and yeah, it can be difficult to find the budget for that, though that is a key part of the strategy in the state. The other thing that we'll note is that a majority of Americans never buy a new vehicle in their lifetime. So what that means is that if you are a person that buys a used car, it can be very difficult to find an electric car on the market if there aren't that many in circulation. And so we think that a policy that increases the number of new electric cars sold in the state all the way to 100% in 2030 will help make sure that as quickly as possible, we can have a robust secondhand market of electric vehicles for people that aren't going to be buying new cars and therefore don't have as much access to EVs. So it's fair in the regard that it'll increase the supply of secondhand electric cars as quickly as possible as well. This is an idea that is taking hold across many other states in the US. It really started with the governor of California, who made a commitment, I think at the end of 2020, to pass regulations that would phase out the sale of new gasoline-powered cars in California starting in 2035. That is huge because California is really the only state in the union that is able to set its own fuel economy standards, which means that that is a policy that now any state can adopt, including Rhode Island. New York similarly passed its own target to phase out gas-powered vehicles by 2035. And that's something that's on the table in Massachusetts this session as well. But I've been talking about a 2030 date. And I've been talking about a 2030 date because not only does it align with what the science says that we need to do in order to meet Rhode Island's climate targets, it also aligns with the date that Washington State has committed to in legislation that was passed in this year. So in a transportation related bill that the Washington State legislature had considered, there is a clear line that says our goal as a state is to make it so that 100% of new car buyers in the state can choose an electric vehicle starting in 2030. And so we think that 2030 is really the right date to shoot for a couple of reasons. The first is that if the state's goal is 2030, then that is a clear way for us to be able to size our charging infrastructure, prepare our electricity grid, and do all of the other planning that's needed to help achieve that target. It's also an aspirational goal, not a binding goal. And so we think that for Rhode Island to be able to stick with the timeline set forth by California, New York, and Massachusetts, we're going to need to really shoot for 2030 and then have 2035 as a fallback. So if we're shooting for 2030, it probably means we'll be landing at 2035, which is the best that we could do and aligns with our neighboring states. But perhaps one of the most important reasons that we think a 2030 date is the day by which 100% of new car sales should be electric, is the fact that polling supports this idea. Our partners at a nonprofit called Cultura recently released a poll that polled Americans across the US, but oversampled in a few key states, including in Massachusetts, asking them, what do you think of the idea of phasing out the sale of new gas-powered cars starting in 2030? And it turns out it's a very popular idea. People like the idea of a 2030 phase out. It aligns with other polls that have been done that confirm that a policy targeting new car buyers is something that most people support and like. And the polling indicated that 2030 is the right date. So in Massachusetts, 62% of those polled said that they would support a policy that requires all new cars to be electric starting in 2030. Nationally, it was about 55%, but still the clear majority. And this was a poll that was conducted across political spectrums, across urban, rural communities, across all folks of all different races, incomes, ages. The data was clear. And so if you are interested in learning more about the results of this poll, it's available online at our blog, and I highly recommend you check it out because we learned lots of interesting things about who's supporting electric vehicles and where this policy had the most support. Specifically, it was interesting for us to find that African American folks and Hispanic folks tended to support the idea of a gasoline phase out even more than other racial groups, largely because of their concern of air quality issues and air pollution in their communities. So we think, again, this is a very equitable, fair way to move forward, considering the scale of the climate crisis and what we need to be able to do to meet it. In terms of technology, I think this is a really important area to focus on because the next question that you might have in your head is, are we going to have enough electric vehicles? Is the technology ready? Are people going to be able to afford them? That is one of the key barriers to preventing people from getting an electric car, is the fact that there is a upfront cost premium associated with electric cars, mostly because of the battery technology that's included in them. So costs are falling very quickly than the cost of solar and how much it's fallen over the last 10 years. And so experts expect that sometime between 2025 and 2027, we're going to see a crossover point where it's actually less expensive to buy an electric car than it is to buy a gas-powered car. That's happening for a few reasons. The first is that, as I mentioned, batteries are getting less expensive, and that's the primary driver of the high upfront cost of an electric car. But the other factor is the fact that electric cars are simpler machines. It's essentially a battery attached to the wheels of the car, and that's it. It's very mechanically simple compared to an internal combustion engine, which has hundreds and hundreds of moving parts that need to be assembled individually. And so there's key savings that can be seen in terms of manufacturing these vehicles because they are simpler. And so we do see this crossover point being or happening in the next couple of years. And what that means is it's not going to be as much of a barrier for people to go ahead and choose an electric car. And note that 2027 is a few years before the target to make 100% of new car sales electric. So we do expect that there's enough of a cushion there to make it so that this target is achievable, even with issues of supply chains and the need to totally change how vehicles are produced in order to create enough electric vehicles for people to buy. The other very exciting development that I think, as someone who follows this industry, I'm surprised by how quickly it's moving all the time, is the fact that automakers, legacy automakers specifically, automakers that have been in operation for many decades, are getting extremely serious about where the market is going in terms of electric vehicles. And so almost every major automaker, including the big ones in the US, including General Motors, Ford, and others, have made commitments to invest billions of dollars in producing and manufacturing electric vehicles. They have targets about how many electric models they want to have available for sale by certain dates. And some of them, specifically General Motors, Honda, and Volkswagen, are committing to ending the sale of gas-powered cars starting by a certain date. So for General Motors, they've committed to not selling gas-powered models starting in 2035. Honda is 2040. Volkswagen doesn't want to have any new gas-powered models past 2026. And so this is a substantial shift in terms of the investments that are happening. And it's also something that is difficult to roll back and almost independent of the federal administration and who's in power. So no matter what happens with the elections in 2024 or beyond that, these are investments that won't be rolled back. They're huge commitments, and it's an indicator as to what kinds of vehicles are going to be available for purchase. And so we think that Rhode Island is late to the party, essentially. Our policies are not reflecting the fact that all of these commitments are being made. And so if we want Rhode Islanders to be able to take advantage of the huge wave of electric vehicles that's coming, then we need to make it so that our policy not only supports electric vehicles, but makes it so that they can be a key part of our strategy to meeting our climate goals. So to this end, a policy, a bill that Green Energy Consumers has been working on very closely with legislators up at the Rhode Island State House is called the Electric Transportation Act. This bill is a bill that essentially tries to pull together a lot of the loose ends that Rhode Island has fallen behind on so that we can advance electric vehicle sales so that every Rhode Islander buying a new car in 2030 can choose to go electric without thinking about where they're going to be charging, whether they can afford it, what dealerships have electric cars in stock, can they, be able to afford the cost of fueling an EV. All of these different components are things that need to be addressed, and quite simply, we need a plan. So the bill has 4 key areas that we think are going to help move the needle in terms of preparing Rhode Island's readiness for electric vehicles. And I'll mention most of these ideas are things that our neighboring states have already done or are committing to do this year, or also have it on their legislative agendas to do so. So this really is reflective of where other states are going and what Rhode Island can do to catch up so that we're not dead last in New England anymore when it comes to EV adoption. And I do just want to thank Senator Alana DeMario and Representative Terry Court-Vriand, who had introduced this bill and have worked really hard to keep clean transportation issues at the forefront of policy being discussed at the State House. So tremendous leadership there, and hope to see that continue to move forward. But as to the specifics of the bill, the first key point is about regulation. So I mentioned that California is the only state that can set its own fuel economy standards, and that other states are able to jump onto those regulations by passing their own rules in order to surpass the meager standards that exist at the federal level. So what that means is this component of the bill, the regulation component, would tie Rhode Island's fuel economy standards to California. California is the largest car market in the nation, and we think that if California is passing regulations to advance clean cars and clean trucks and clean fleets, then Rhode Island should be quickly jumping on that, because the automakers are following and looking to what California is doing. So we should be moving as fast as them. This provision of the bill would require Rhode Island to adopt advanced standards coming out of California within 1 year of their release. So that means we're not going to delay, we're going to quickly jump on the policy opportunities that come from out of state, and we're going to align with our neighbors in doing so. One example of how this has played out in the past is with a regulation called the Advanced Clean Trucks Rule. That was released in California about 1.5 years, 2 years ago, and 5 other states had committed to adopting that rule. Rhode Island has moved slowly and hasn't quite written the regulations and participated in the rulemaking process to jump on that, which means we're going to see delayed benefits on the order of 2 or 3 years, which is just simply not fast enough if we are going to meet our climate goals. The second piece of this bill is all about preparation. So as I've been talking about, the bill establishes an aspirational goal to make 100% of new vehicle registrations electric starting in 2030. The important part of this goal is that we need a plan to be able to make that 2030 date feasible. So we need a process that takes a look at our grid infrastructure, our utility policy, our incentives, and pretty much every piece of infrastructure that we're going to install to make sure that it's all guiding us to being able to make it so that all Rhode Islanders are buying electric cars starting in 2030. The third piece is about public input, because we know that even with an equity forward type of idea like this one, we need to make sure that Rhode Islanders aren't getting left behind in the transition to electric cars, specifically lower income Rhode Islanders who maybe aren't going to struggle to afford an electric car even as costs decline and as more incentives come out. So the idea behind this section of the bill is that we need good policy and public input from folks to make sure that our programs and our policies are aligned so that all Rhode Islanders can take advantage of them. We expect that different community, health, and labor groups should have a say in this so that we're not having any blind spots with this transition. And then finally, there is a key portion of the bill that's all about having the state lead by example. So number 4 is about setting mandatory goals for the state to electrify its vehicles. So vehicles that state employees drive or vehicles that are used for a public purpose should be electric starting in 2027. That aligns with what the Biden administration has set as their goal for electrifying their fleet. And so we think that Rhode Island should be moving at least as fast as the federal fleet. There's also some other goals to help make sure that we electrify medium and heavy duty vehicles as well, because we know cars are a big part of the problem, but not the entire problem. And so pretty much every one of these sections has additional language about how we can move the needle forward on those big electric or big diesel emitting trucks and buses as well. I know I just went through a lot of information about what the bill does and how it can help move Rhode Island forward on getting rid of gasoline, but I just wanted to touch on a couple of the key provisions to help bring these pieces together. So as an example of what we need to be able to plan for to meet that 2030 goal, one key thing is charging expansion. We have lots of federal money coming down the pipeline to Rhode Island to expand charging stations. We need to figure out how many we need and what workforce development needs the state is going to have in order to help build out those charging infrastructure pieces. One thing that I'm not going to be able to dive into during today's webinar is about the fact that Rhode Island is going to see a huge increase in the amount of jobs we have in the electricity and electrician sector because we're going to need to build out all of this infrastructure. Notably, Rhode Island has very, very few gasoline industry jobs. We don't, dig for oil here. We don't refine oil here. And so all of the money that we're spending on gasoline essentially flows out of state to the benefit of other states' economies. And so when we transition to electric vehicles and electricity as a fuel source, that means we're creating more jobs here to build out that infrastructure and also keeping more of the benefits local, because electricity is a locally generated resource. So lots of interesting plans and benefits to take advantage of there. As I mentioned earlier, it's not all about electric cars or even big trucks and buses. We also just need to rely less on our vehicles overall. That'll do a few things. It'll make it so that all Rhode Islanders have a variety of low carbon transportation options. So your only option shouldn't just be a car, but thinking about the bus system, which is also electrifying very quickly, and other ways of getting around like walking and biking, which can be electrified as well. So the bill has some provisions about setting goals to reduce vehicle miles traveled over the next 10 years in a way that aligns with our state's transit plan. Another key area, again, is our grid infrastructure. So that's a common thing or myth that people will say to criticize electric vehicles, is the fact that our grid can't handle it, that our infrastructure is too old, that we are going to need more electricity resources. All of those things are true, but they're not insurmountable. And so part of what this bill does is it starts to establish a plan to upgrade our electric infrastructure so that our utilities and our regulators, called at the PUC, know what's coming and can plan so that our policy and the incentives given to the utility align with the infrastructure that we need to build out. There's also a very exciting opportunity in terms of programs that we can offer to EV drivers to help make sure that we are minimizing the impacts to our electric grid while also providing lower fuel costs to drivers. Some of you may be participating in a program like this already, but it's essentially a smart charge program that rewards you actual cash or gives you a discount on your electric bill for charging an EV at off-peak times. And so what that accomplishes is if you are charging your electric car at times when the grid is not very strained and there's not a lot of demand, then that means that we can avoid costly upgrades to the system that would otherwise be needed if you were going to be charging that vehicle at the time when everyone else is using electricity and the system is strained. And so it delivers lower costs to drivers. It means we can avoid costly upgrades, and it creates an additional incentive to switch to an electric car because it lowers the cost of electricity and makes it even more competitive with gas. So it's really a win-win-win type of policy, and that's the kind of thing that we can take advantage of to move our climate goals forward. And the window of opportunity for these kinds of programs is shrinking because the more we delay, the more we miss out on the benefits of these smart policy programs. And I talked about this a little bit already, but we think that the state should be leading by example when it comes to electrification. Electric cars are already cost effective on a lifetime basis when you compare them to gas-powered cars because of lower fuel costs, lower maintenance, and other things that reduce the lifetime cost of ownership. And so not only would it be great for the state to lead by example to help meet our climate goals, but it also would help save taxpayer money and make sure that we are investing in vehicles that are lower cost to operate. So there are some key win-win opportunities there as well. And we just need some clearer goals for the state to be able to take action on those things. So where are we in the process of getting this bill moving forward? On the screen here, I have a little list on all of the steps that a bill needs to take in order to become law. You might already know this if you're very civically minded and engaged, but it's always a good reminder for folks to kind of see exactly everything that needs to happen for this idea to become reality. And so generally, the first step is that the senator and representative introduce the bill. It's referred to a committee. That committee kind of hears testimony from different folks, stakeholders, people who oppose it, people who support it, to help collect information on where the bill can be improved and what information is out there to help make them their decision on whether the bill should move forward or not. That bill is amended to reflect the improvements and ideas that people have put in to help make sure that it's in the best form that it can be. And that's where we're at right now, is green energy consumers and other stakeholders are working with the sponsors of this bill to help improve it, to refine the language, and to give it the best chance of moving forward this year. Unfortunately, the time in this session is running out, and so we're getting limited time to be able to move this bill forward out of committee, which would require a vote, and then would require full approval of the House and Senate in order to move forward. So we are running out of time, but there is something that you can do to help this bill move forward this session, which is simply to write to your lawmakers. Based on my experience at the Rhode Island State House and talking to legislators about electric vehicles, how they're coming, what the issues of making the transition to them are, there's still a lot of misinformation out there, and there's a lack of urgency about how we need to move policy forward in order to support them. And so there's literally nothing better that you could do than to reach out to your lawmaker to say that you support the bill and that you want to see action on it this session. We have started a letter writing campaign that makes it really easy to reach out to your legislator, because we have a draft ready and you can kind of edit it to be more personalized, which I will send as a follow-up to this webinar. But really, there's no substitute for just going out and speaking to your elected official. That's what is necessary to move ideas like this forward, and will help get the bill on the agenda for passage. But we also know that lawmakers are influenced not just by constituent emails, but also by things that they read in the paper, especially local outlets. And so Green Energy Consumers, in addition to helping people reach out to their lawmakers, is also starting an op-ed campaign to help spread awareness about electric vehicles even more broadly. And so we're trying to keep this issue local, because ultimately it is a local issue. If you're having trouble finding charging in your community, or you can't convince your condo association to install charging, that's a local issue. Those are stories that we want to tell in order to help create the urgency for this bill's passage. We recently were able to get an op-ed placed in the Providence Journal about the bill, which is really exciting. But it's not just Providence that needs to hear this. We need every community across the state to indicate that Rhode Islanders are ready for the switch and policy should support them. And so I'll also send information about how to write a letter to the editor or an op-ed to help raise awareness in your community. Definitely would appreciate any personal input or stories that you all have in order to help us create the urgency that we need. And that is it. I do see questions have been coming in, so I would love to answer them. But just wanted to acknowledge again that this is our 40th anniversary as an organization. And this work, our advocacy work, wouldn't be possible without the support of donations from folks like you. So if you like what you heard today and you want to help us continue to do this work to push lawmakers and stakeholders to move forward on climate policy, then please consider donating. You can choose whether you want to donate to a specific program or just send money where it's needed, but anything that you could do would be helpful. So I'm going to move on to the questions portion. I see a few coming in, and don't be shy if you have questions, as we have 15 minutes to answer them. Okay, here's a question that has come in from Stephen. He asked, what about instead of only targeting new car sales, there were programs to incentivize trade-ins of gas-powered vehicles to get them off the road? That is a really interesting question, Stephen, and a really good idea. So a couple of thoughts on that. The first is that we don't think that it's feasible for a small state like Rhode Island to do the kind of trade-in program that you're discussing if it was only us. So as I mentioned, the idea of a phase out of new car sales is an idea that has been pursued in many other states in the country. And so Rhode Island really would be part of a larger wave implementing this kind of policy, which is an advantage when you're a small state. In terms of the logistics of being able to trade in a gas-powered vehicle and then receive an incentive for a new electric vehicle, it would be more difficult to implement. Not that it's a bad idea, it's just doesn't have as much momentum nationally. We would love to see a program like that, perhaps on the federal level. I remember the Cash for Clunkers program that happened, what was it, 2009, 2010, that allowed people to do something similar. And so we see that more of a federal level program that people could take advantage of. That being said, really large, well-resourced states have started to experiment with that idea, especially for low and moderate income folks. So the program that comes to mind for me is a program implemented by the state of California, because California has done every program and policy under the sun to try and incentivize electric car sales. And so they ran a program called Clean Cars for All that was specifically targeted towards low and moderate income Californians to trade in their old gas-powered car in favor for either an incentive for a new electric car, a transit pass, so giving up a car entirely and just taking the bus or transit system instead, or an incentive for an electric bike. So that solution is interesting because it also allows people to switch from a gas-powered car to another low emissions travel option that might be better depending on, you know, what transit options are in your area or what your commute is like. It's just good to give people options. And so that's definitely one policy that we're thinking about at Green Energy Consumers in terms of, you know, we want to make sure that people have access to electric cars, but that also we're incentivizing greater usage of transit and other low carbon options as well. But I would say the key thing is we would want to see other states move forward on a program like that so that Rhode Island can take advantage of it. That's a great question. Bob is asking, does the state currently have a tax credit program to encourage electric vehicle purchases? So the answer is no, but it will soon. Rhode Island recently announced a program called Drive EV, which is an electric vehicle incentive program that gives folks a cash voucher or a rebate to buy a new or used electric car. The value depends on whether the car is all electric, so battery electric, or a plug-in hybrid, but battery electric vehicles will receive $2,500 and plug-in hybrids under the current program proposal would receive a $1,500 incentive. Unfortunately, the program has only been allocated about $1.25 million, which is enough by the Office of Energy Resources math to support 600 EV purchases, which is not nearly enough to be able to move forward on this. But if you are in the car market or shopping for a new car at some point this summer, then that is a program that you may be able to take advantage of to help get an electric car. The comment period for that program has just closed, so they're taking in feedback that people have submitted to the program and anticipate opening the rebate up starting sometime in July. But we green energy consumers know that this is one of the best programs to help people access electric vehicles. And so we're strongly advocating for more money to be dedicated to this program and for it to be offered consistently so that people can take advantage of it over the next couple of years without being uncertain as to whether there are incentives or there are not, because we know that consistency is really important. So look out for more information this summer. Green energy consumers will certainly write a blog post about it so that folks who want to take advantage of it will know what the details are, but it's coming. Kevin is asking about the current status of hydrogen cars. Has the idea been abandoned? That's a really interesting question. So the long and short of it is that lithium-ion batteries that are found in electric cars improved in cost and energy density so dramatically, far more dramatically than anyone could have guessed 5 or 6 years ago, that they are out competing hydrogen vehicles. The key problem with hydrogen is that you need to be able to create an entire distribution network essentially to get hydrogen to the places where people are going to refuel. And so that is a bit of a disadvantage when you compare that to electricity, which is very readily available. It's all over the place, and it's much easier to deliver that as a fuel compared to having to totally build a new infrastructure for hydrogen. I think Rhode Island has exactly one hydrogen refueling station, and it's in the parking lot of the Stop and Shop on Branch Avenue in Providence, which is kind of close to me. So yeah, I think that was working against it heavily. That being said, there's still a lot of potential for hydrogen as a fuel source for really big vehicles that travel very long distances. So thinking about like heavy duty long hauler trucks that ship goods, that's going to be a hard case for electrification even in 20 or 25 years as the technology matures. And so that's one potential opportunity for hydrogen, is to use it for those really unique use cases. That being said, I think the electric vehicle market has just taken off so quickly that it's going to beat out hydrogen for most passenger cars. And we may see that change in the future, but the emphasis is really on EVs. It's been beat out. I've been thinking of the like VHS Betamax situation where there was a winner and a loser, and the winner ended up taking off. So that's kind of a similar situation. But I'm sure you'll see more hydrogen cars in the future, just probably not on the scale that we're going to see with electric vehicles. And so we don't see the usefulness of supporting them with policy as much. So many good questions. Thanks for sending them in. Stephen sent another one in that asked, I'm not a big fan of advertising, but is there any plan to make the public aware of all the benefits of EVs, and the fact that it would be actually dumb to buy an ICE vehicle very soon? Most folks have no practical knowledge of EVs and still see them as fringe. Yeah, so you know, as much as I would love to have the sale of new gas-powered vehicles disappear overnight, we know that it's something that is going to happen as a process, because so far they have been a very small technology. But the way that I like to think about it is how smartphones became popular. Like thinking of, 2008, 2009, the first iPhone was a very niche, small audience product. And then as soon as people started to buy more of them, they became more popular and sales went up like this. And then eventually, now they're commonplace, right? It's like most people have access to this technology that was just a niche product 10 or 12 years ago. So that's the direction that electric vehicles are heading, because you're right, there are major advantages to them outside of the climate benefits, because they're, as I mentioned earlier, lower cost to maintain, lower fuel costs, they drive better, they handle smoother, they're quiet, like people just like these cars as better options. And so I do expect that with the serious commitments that automakers have made, we're going to see more of that. As an example, I think if you watched the Super Bowl this year, there were more commercials for electric vehicles than there were gas-powered vehicles. That's going to be huge when automakers really start pouring advertising dollars into these vehicles, because it's going to help improve that awareness. But the other key component that I think Rhode Island has been dragging on is the fact that knowing someone who drives an electric car, whether it's a neighbor, a family member, a friend, a coworker, helps to eliminate some of the myths that exist around them. And so, if you talk to someone that doesn't know very much about electric cars, they'll say, oh, but it takes forever to charge, and they may not realize how much more convenient it can be to just have to plug into your garage compared to having to make an additional trip to a gas station. And so that information sharing is going to happen over time as we increase sales, and as more people just see charging stations around in their community, in their neighborhoods, being driven around. So the power of just kind of seeing other people that have done it first, like monkey see, monkey do, is going to be really, really powerful. But you're absolutely right. I think the state needs to do a better job of communicating what the benefits are and how people can take advantage of them. And that's one reason we really are supporting the state of Rhode Island lead by example, because if we can get state vehicles to be electric, then that's going to expose way more people to electric cars faster than they otherwise might have seen them. And it'll help move the needle forward just in terms of comfort with the shifting technology. I happen to own an electric car that I bought used, and I love it. I, have had plenty of conversations with folks that have stopped me in parking lots or other places to ask me questions about it. And so just being able to increase visibility is going to be very important. And then the cost savings benefits speak for themselves. I think lots of people are hurting with the higher gas prices right now. And there is interesting data that came from Google about how when gas prices started to go up, so did Google searches for electric vehicles. So in that regard, people are already thinking about it, planning on making their next car electric. We just need to create the policy and the infrastructure so that when they do decide to make that decision, they're not held back because their apartment building doesn't have charging, for example. I have one more question that I want to get to. I know we're at the top of the hour, but this is a good one from Raymond. Do we know what the new electric company that bought out National Grid has as their position on electric cars and charging station installations? Excellent question. So for folks that don't know, recently a company called PPL has purchased National Grid and is going to be operating as the state's primary utility company very soon. That transitioning is happening now. It was formalized yesterday. And so that was a key point of contention because Green Energy Consumers Alliance participated in the docket that explored or investigated the sale to make sure that it was in the interests of Rhode Islanders. So one point that Green Energy Consumers was making in our advocacy there is that, is this new utility company prepared to expand infrastructure, install charging stations, and be a partner to help make sure that Rhode Island is ready for electric vehicles. National Grid had programs not only in Rhode Island, but in New York State and Massachusetts to help install charging infrastructure. And we really benefited from the fact that they're rolling out lots of similar programs in multiple states. And so that is a key question that we were asking as well. The answer, to my knowledge, is that a lot of the program staff that were working at National Grid in Rhode Island to help roll out charging stations and prepare our infrastructure are still going to be on staff at PPL. So we have that retained knowledge and experience to continue the existing programs. And in terms of what the utility company will do in the future, that is a key piece of the Electric Transportation Act. So the bill essentially directs the utilities to file more proposals to help support EV charging infrastructure and to start to develop the kinds of programs that we know are going to be needed to prepare the grid. So it's worth noting the utility company will never do anything of its own accord unless it's directed to do so by the public, by law, or by the Public Utilities Commission. And so that is a key area where we think policy is going to be important, because we need to guide what they're going to do and the kinds of proposals that they put forward. We have no idea as to what the quality of those proposals are going to be. To my knowledge, PPL doesn't have a whole lot of experience in implementing those kinds of programs, but we know that they're going to need direction. And so that's where we see policy being key, is giving them the direction that they need in order to move those programs forward. It may be a few years until we see that happening, but Green Energy Consumers Alliance is very intent on making sure that the conversation happens sooner than that, because we can't wait for years for more EV charging and more EV programs. So time will tell, but I'm cautiously optimistic that we can work with them to continue to deliver the upgrades that Rhode Island needs to advance EVs. And with that, it is 1:02, so I think I'm going to end the questions there, but I highly encourage, if you have more questions, to reach out to me. I'll be sending a follow-up email after this webinar with some of the resources that may help you either write an op-ed or write to your legislator about what Rhode Island can do to support a phase out of gasoline as soon as possible. And so you'll have my email. Feel free to ask me questions or reach out to see how you can help green energy consumers move this idea forward. I really appreciate the excellent questions and the time that you gave me this afternoon to hear what we've been working on. And I hope to see you at a future Green Energy Consumers event, because we host webinars like this all the time on a variety of different topics related to energy, advocacy, and the different programs that we run. So check out our website. Please stay engaged with our work, which is only made possible by folks like you who are interested and engaged. And thanks so much. Have a good rest of your afternoon.